for the 9, feeling that wound on basically no matter any time I try to differentiate on my own, whether it's like an internal sense of self or whether it's an external exhibition of this is an I, it hurts. It's me trying to be my own person that is the problem. And I'm willing to let myself change and adapt to what's going on outside of me. Perhaps then that's when I will feel both loved and supported.
The Big Hormone Enneagram.
Hi, I'm John Lukovich, sexual self-pres 4 with 5 wing, 458 trifix.
Hi, I'm David Gray, self-pres sexual 9 with a 1, 974 trifix.
What up? It's Emeka. I'm an 8 wing 7, sexual self-pres with 854 fixes.
Hi, I'm Nancy. I am a self-pres social 3, wing 4 with a 369 trifix. If you like our podcast, guys, make sure you go like and subscribe us on the Apple Podcast app. And if you really like us, you should definitely leave us a review.
One of the implications of the object relations stuff is that part of the way the ego continues to operate the way it wants to operate is it needs its external environment to operate a certain way as well. It needs the object to continue to do the stuff that enables the ego to have certain assumptions and beliefs. And I think that's like a really interesting and practical way of sort of exploring what each of the types are believing and assuming about other people, and basically asking people to do in order for their ego to sort of stay in its habit and pattern. And I think the 9 is a good example of asking people, expecting people to take up more and more space, and people responding and actually doing that, and sort of continuing this dance that the 9 is doing with the world. And I'm really curious how to break that up.
So what I hear Courtney talking about or describing is the way that we unconsciously train. Like, not only does the personality do its own thing to reinforce its status quo, but it's also training the world to respond to, each type is training the world to respond to it in a specific way. It's like setting it up, setting the stage for itself, so that whether it's like we end up disappointed or whatever, it's like we kind of prompting the world to disappoint us, or how it might
We
be.
set up a certain ping of the dynamic to ricochet in a certain way, and it does.
Right, exactly. Welcome to Big Hormone Enneagram. This is your Dark Lords of the Enneagram, featuring the returning High Priestess of Despair, Courtney Smith, to talk more about object relations and give our 6s and 9s a little bit more love, because we were exhausted at the end of our calls that we did the previous object relations series on. So welcome, Courtney.
Hey, guys. And Nancy.
Hi.
We were talking about Courtney's insights into object relations and weaving that in with her understanding of early childhood dynamics and parenting and things like that, to describe and get a visceral sense of the object relations, especially within how it works in the inner triangle of the Enneagram, types 9, 3, and 6. And last time we built on, we started with 3, went to 6, and to 9 to describe how these types are what are called attachment types. And in being attachment types, unlike the 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7, which are hexad types, the attachment types in their relationship with their parental figures found ways of adapting themselves in order to receive love and support in different ways. And one of the phrases Courtney used was to make themselves okay with whatever love or support was available. And so, Courtney, I don't remember exactly the phrasing you used for the 3, but you were describing how the 3 was finding love to look or be experienced in a certain way, and constantly adapting themselves to try to get that, like, to evoke that sense of what the parent could offer in terms of love. Is that correct?
Yeah, and just to back up a little bit, when we talked about the object relation stuff, we talked about, in the broadest sense, the two kind of main functions that parents are providing in terms of ego development. And the first is what we call the nurturing function. And this was a sense of unconditional love, and a willingness to be um, seen and loved. And the second function that we talked about was the protective function, which is um, instilling the confidence and support necessary for a self to go out in the world and sort of live to its fullest potential. And what we talked about is that obviously all parents are failing in big and small ways in their ability to perfectly deliver these two sort of essential features for relatively stable and healthy ego development. But what ends up happening is parents are doing this left and right, but certain types are identified with the failing more than others. And as they identify with the failing, the failure of the parent to either nurture and love or to support and guide, they have to make sense with that of that identification and come up with a story, basically, to hold that wound and go on with life despite feeling that pain. And I originally started thinking a lot about this because as a six and an attachment type, I would talk about it with John, and I really didn't even understand what it meant. It was it just it had the word had no meaning to me, and so I really needed to go and explore sort of frustration and rejection, and this idea that the other types, the hexad types, the wound that comes from a parent failing to love perfectly or failing to support perfectly. The attachment type is basically not willing to call out the parent for a failure to deliver. And instead, what the 3, 6, and 9 are doing is they are basically saying it's on me. The reason this parental figure, I didn't feel seen or I didn't feel supported, is because I didn't, quote, do this right. And so if I just change myself a little bit, I'm going to watch very carefully to see what provokes that feeling of unconditional love or that feeling of support and guidance. And I'm going to do that over and over again to try to retain that feeling rather than acknowledge that my parents are not doing what they're supposed to do. And so there's the 3, 6, and 9. And the 3 we spoke a little bit about. This is a failure of the nurturing function, and we used that this sort of moment of the baby, sitting on the changing table, and giggling or smiling and looking up and hoping that the mom mirrors her back, and the mom doesn't, and the baby feels missed. And rather than sit with the pain of that, the baby kind of says, well, other times I felt this love. Other times you smiled back. What did I do wrong? What could I do differently? And instead of smiling, they frown, or instead of they smile bigger, or they make a noise. All the time, very, very attuned to what's happening in their external environment to create that feeling again. And if that happens over and over and over again, the baby's sense of self, the baby's ability to smile spontaneously because he or she feels like it, or to frown or to grimace or to do whatever they want to do, is now being mediated, is now arising only to produce an external feeling of love. And over time, for the 3, that becomes a lost sort of sense of self and a sense of knowing one's own heart and knowing who one is, because there's been a willingness to, and a totally understandable willingness to mold their self identity in a way that allows them to feel nurtured by their parents.
You had said something, about the false heart, And I think that, like, can you elaborate on what you referred to that time?
Well, I think that, as a six for me, when I learn things about the Enneagram, I of course go like, why or really? And for me, as I've talked and learned about how the nine different types overuse or underuse certain centers, the heart, body, and the mind center. One of the things that John and I had talked about, and I think other teachers talk about, is that the hexad types, whatever type they're in, the hexad body types, the 1 and the 8, are overusing their body centers. The 4 and the 2 are overusing their heart centers, and the 5 and the 7 are over relying upon their mind. And that leads to an imbalance in terms of what they do with the other remaining two centers. For the attachment types, instead, what's happening is, and overusing means also sort of and John can clarify this too. Overusing also means sort of identifying with it as like a key element, a key instrument through which personality is expressed, and sort of what makes them them, what makes what makes a 101 is a bodily sense of integrity, and they become identified with that bodily sense of integrity. Same with the 8 in terms of like energy and intensity.
It's like an
And
over specialization of that center in one direction or another.
and in contrast to that, the 3, 6, and 9, what John and I talked about was like a lack of integration. And what that means is, the heart is doing its thing for the 3, and it's separate from the body and the mind, the doing and the thinking about doing, and the planning and like the will to go forth. And this was very confusing to me. Why would the attachment types, why would the inner triangle have this different pattern of organizing information coming from their centers? And the 6, the mind is separate from feeling in the body, and the 9, the body is separate from the mind and the heart. And for me, trying to understand, like, why would you take information, you're taking in information from all 3 of these places, you'd have personality operating within all 3 of these centers, but there's kind of like a gulf, like a separation, a wall between, for the 3, the heart and the mind and the body. And as I was trying to figure out why that would be the case, and I started thinking about attachment and started trying to understand what it might be like to be a 3, these images to me kept coming up of, you keep things separate when you don't want the left hand to know what the right hand is doing, right? Like if all 3 centers come together, it's somehow the ego's not going to be able to operate. And so I started thinking about that, and I started imagining, especially for the 3, because I think that if you talk to many 3s, they've gone a very long time unexamining the things that made them feel love from their parents. Is that really them or not? And I think for the 3, they come to believe that's who they really are. And so part of the reason why their real heart needs to be kept separate is because they've bought into an idea of, this is who I really am. If the attachment types were to sort of acknowledge, if the ego were to admit that their sense of self had been molded to the outside world, no grown-up wants to say that, unless they've sort of done the work and acknowledged and be really open and honest about what's going on. Real adults pride themselves right on their self-reliance and their independence and all this kind of stuff. And so the 3 has to kind of do these like gymnastics around, this is who I really am. And that is the false heart that I'm talking about.
Right.
They basically have bought into the idea that the external definition is actually their real heart. And they need to keep their true sense of self dead and asleep and as far away from everything else as possible. Because when it starts to pop up, it's not going to feel good, and it's going to put the ego in a threatening position. It will threaten the ego's survival, to hear real noise, real information, from from their true sense of self.
Yeah. And so then leading into the 6, from adapting to the misses of the nurturing function to adapting to the misses of the protecting function. How do you see that? Like, in what especially did we really like fail to bring out in the last time we talked about this?
I don't think we did the walking through the child and how they experienced that miss. I think we didn't do that for 6 and 9.
Hmm.
Yeah. And before I go on, I think the other thing that I want to say about the 3 is this fundamental kind of deceit that what one has been taught to do or expected to do or understood they need to do in order to get by in the world, to some extent, all of us have bought into the idea that that's ourself. And so that is sort of the fundamental. And I actually believe that part of the reason people are uncomfortable with 3s is the self deceit is actually something that all of us are doing. We're
Totally.
all we're all believing that, like, if we just do what our the doing of our personality is who we really are.
3 is the archetype for the mask of personality.
Absolutely.
And, like, that says it so concisely. Um, and so I think that's why understanding the 369 are really important, because it's actually a trick we're all, to some extent, all of us are playing on ourselves. And the 3, as you learn about the Enneagram, you have to face it in a way that all of us need to face.
Yeah, I think that brings up like what I'm always talking to people when I'm teaching or whatever about is, there's sort of a cliche that you're not your personality, like we all kind of get that on some sort of simple level, but to really understand the implication of it is that your personality is a tool for, as you say, getting by in the world. And like we put so much pride and narcissism and um, exalt the personality, this sort of coping or this management tool for instinct. We give it so much weight and identity, when we do that in the absence of having cultivated some kind of center of gravity or inner life. But that's so important, is that it's not just 3s that do this. Like we're all doing this same game, but it's just not as maybe obvious to other people the ways that we're doing it, and it's probably more obvious to other people than we think we are being, uh,
Mhm.
depending on our type.
And so if we move to the 6 and 9, we just can sort of talk about, and David can comment on the idea of them each being archetypes. But I think also it's important to give both of them a lot of time, because I think, as you guys have said elsewhere, those are the types that are most prevalent. And I think the other thing that's interesting about both of them is just, and we can kind of get into it, just how much they're giving up in the way that they've made sense and tried to live and manage the pain that they experienced when they tried to self differentiate as a baby. So the 6, is lying on the changing table, and maybe it's missed or maybe it's not. But the point is that the 6 is not identifying with that. And so I just want to clarify that it's not like the 6 had perfect nurturing function. It's just that the 6 is not, that's not part of where, how, that's not the wound that the personality coalesced around to protect.
Hmm.
Rather, the 6, and we sort of talked about this as the prototypical, what does it mean to feel the protective function or to feel guidance and support? We talked about, a toddler, struggling to get up on her feet, and there's a toy or, a cookie or whatever, something that's 10 feet away. And she begins with outstretched arms and teetering feet to kind of make her way to something she wants. And she's trying to do it on her own. And she feels very nervous. She feels scared. She feels hesitant. And she looks around. She looks to her parent to tell her she can do it, that she should do it. And the parent misses it. And rather than acknowledge the wound or and continue to keep on, or respond in some other way to the fact that the parent is not supporting and guiding the toddler and going after what she wants, the toddler instead begins to shift their attention to what should I do differently to create that feeling of support and guidance that I need to make it in this world? And the toddler over and over again begins taking her eyes off of what she wants and her internal capacity to get what she wants, and instead begins to use all of that energy and all of that force to elicit support and guidance. And along the way, can lose sight of what she was going for, because now she's not looking at the cookie or the toy anymore. She's looking over at the authority figure and looking for a certain reaction. She begins to question how she puts one foot in front of the other, because now it's not about going forward anymore. That's not the goal of this. The goal is now to feel support and guidance. And over time, that becomes this sixth figure who's constantly looking for support and guidance externally, and is feeling responsible and feeling like the ability to get that support and guidance is a function of what he or she does. And that becomes um, the guiding light, the guiding reason for the sixth, what the personality is going after now as a way to meet needs, as opposed to sourcing independently. This is what I want to meet my instinct, to meet my needs, and I have the capacity to get it.
One of the terms you use, either when you and I were just talking about it or on the call, was this perversion of desire for like you use the word perversion. This perversion of a desire for a specific aim or an expression of personal will with this desire for support, and so that there was that um, sense of my own wanting gets so washed up in eliciting some kind of support, that there's just this sort of psychological knot that occurs.
Yeah, I mean, I think because I'm a six, I can really feel the suffering, the suffering we create, and our desire to manage this initial suffering, which is we give up an awful lot, and we sacrifice a sense of, as you sort of described, a sense of what we actually want, and what are our capabilities to go after it. And instead, all of that has now been is now running through this lens, running through this gate of, am I getting support from the world? And that becomes, it's perverting. That becomes the defining thing the six is trying to go after, instead of, you know, what do I want to do with my life?
So when you were from this point of view, this narrative of the child, um, you were describing how the six is looking to elicit support or to do something to get support. Can you give examples of like what that looks like and how that translates into adulthood?
Yeah, and I think that one of the things about, in contrast to the three, who I think, you know, the the feeling of nurturing and unconditional love, I think that part of the differentiation of ego is happens earlier in child development. And so there's a more limited number of figures in the kid's life, the baby's life, who the baby is willing to mold him or herself to elicit that feeling.
Hmm.
And so it becomes very much easier for that child to then kind of coalesce their own sense of self onto, this is what I did for my mom, basically to feel loved by her. And over time now I think it's me. And there's kind of a coherence. It's
Hmm.
false, but there's a coherence to the I there. It's not been internally generated.
Right.
I think in contrast to the six, this feeling of support and guidance, I think that because this is about sort of engaging in the world, there's actually a lot of different ways you can feel a failure of support or guidance, and I think and a lot of different ways to elicit support and guidance from a wider variety of authority figures. And so I think that's part of what gives the six this sort of, all over the map kind of unpredictability, the passivity and the aggressiveness, the paralysis and the overaction, all of that whole range is sort of in the toolbox of a 6, because, you know, when I tried to walk and go for that toy, did they ignore me and pretend that I didn't even know that I was trying to do it? And so I had to start making noise and crying and like wailing that I couldn't do it to get the person to engage. Were they so attentive in my ability to like go after the toy that they started correcting me and like telling me how to do it in the middle of it? And so
Mm,
I sort of instead withdrew and kind of
mm.
was paralyzed by, I need to listen to this outside figure. If I just do it this way, it'll work out. You can sort of imagine that full range of, you know, different ways
Right.
a parent in a very early vulnerable moment may signal to the kid, you can't do this on your own.
Part of the difficulty sometimes in introducing type 6 to people is that 6s can look so different. Like, every 6 is
Mhm.
so varied in how they express sixness. Yeah, that's a very interesting point, that developmentally this sense of individuation comes and functioning on an individual level comes later, and so that there's a lot more to draw from and more signals that have to be interpreted, and that results in different ego strategies.
Speaking archetypally too, like what you're getting at there, Courtney, with 3 has a coherence. That's a singularity. It's a single 3, right? Whereas 6 is now the problem of being 2 threes. 2 times 3 is 6, right? And so there's
Hmm.
multiple kinds of splittings that
Hmm.
represents. Hmm.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then 9 is 3 threes, and then you got a whole other mess,
Big
right?
mess. Big mess. Hey, so Courtney, I want to ask you. We're using this term authority figure, and I know some 6s have had a real issue. I mean, I understand it's a use of language, but I was curious from your point of view. Have they have a real issue of either, with authority figure as a term, or seeing what we are using or labeling authority figures as authority figures? um
Hmm.
and that there's a part of part of the challenge of 6 is like, is my will my own, basically, or is my will independent? And so then, when speaking with 6s about this conflict with quote unquote authority figures, it brings up, consciously or unconsciously, resistance to admitting a certain dynamic with authority. So I was curious how you interpreted that.
That's really interesting. I had a when I first well, first of all, I thought I was a 1 for a very long time, and kind of refused to be a 6, and then or own up to my sixness. And one of the reasons I gave is like, I don't have trouble with authority. Like, I don't even, that word doesn't even resonate for me.
Mm,
So it's really interesting that you say that. I think, first of all, in the same way that we sort of talked about the 3 needing to come up with like a plausible narrative for how they're still a grown up, how they've you live an independent, self-reliant, grown up life as a 6. The 6 is not going to say, you're right, like I just like I do whatever someone tells me to do. Like, no grown up is gonna like, have done the work and like really see what's going on. Like, no one's gonna lead with that. And
right.
so to be punched in the gut with that being sort of a key feature of your personality, I think is really hard for people to take. No one wants to hear that. Um, and I think part of the reason why it's such a punch in the gut for the 6 is they actually know it's true. And part of, like, in the same way that the real heart of the 3 needs to be kept separate from the being and the mind and the body of the 3, because if they connect to their real sense of I, their real sense of self, the ego structure begins to crumble. I think the same thing is going on with the 6, where, when we get in touch with, you know, what am I here to do? What do I want? What am I capable of? um, that begins to, it creates a lot of conflict with how the ego has organized itself. And it's inevitable that those little sparks are going to come up. And so to clamp and the solution to that is not to be like, well, I just do what everyone tells me to do, and so everything's perfectly fine. So the six has got to then figure out a narrative, which is the answer cannot be I'm doing what everyone else tells me to do. It has to be, well, I'm like looking at, like I'm weighing my options and I'm collecting external information and I'm
Right.
trying to figure out what the best thing to do is. There's like a rationalization of the externalization of will and guidance and intent. And I think it's kind of what I would sort of say this false mind that the six is using. They're not they're outsourcing it, but we don't call it outsourcing. We like let it filter in through this overactive mind of ours and then call it our own.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This sort of compensating for the externalization of will, like, because yeah, it's not like I'm just listening to what people tell me to do and to doing that kind of thing or just going along with it. But it's still there's a lot of activity that replaces just being able to sort of be in contact with your own, in a sense, naked will or like just direct will. That there is still an externalization process, but that the mind uses its busyness to sometimes obfuscate the kind of real situation.
It feels like, at least from my perspective, feels like decentralized guidance. 'Cause, like, you can't say that um, I'm looking up to one person, but it feels like there's this blob of voices that I always have to factor in and figure out what I'm going to do.
Well, and yeah, I think one of the things that's really complicated for the six is when there are multiple external sources who disagree.
Yeah.
And it's like, now what do I do? And so, and we're faced with, because it's actually it like we're what we're really scared of is it's not is that support and guidance falling away. So how do I thread the needle where every single one of those people is happy and feels like their voice has been attended to and is part of the decision making process and all of that kind of like stuff that a six is doing around that like council, like that dinner table in their head of, oh, what does my dad think? And what does my mom think? Like, and then trying to come up with a coherent decision that doesn't piss any of those people off.
And at the same time expressing doubts to all of those people. Right.
Well, yeah, and part of this is all being done in a very sort of through this lens of being rational, being analytical, considering all
Mhm.
your options, considering all your viewpoints, pros and cons. Things can always change. There's always new information. No one can ever
Mhm.
see anything. All of the all of those stories sort of enable that process to continue. And the the problem is that, I mean, one problem is that the six is really doubting him or herself. Like that's who we're really doubting. And it gets projected
Mhm.
onto these other sources. But it's really about what started it in the first place, which is I can't locate this internally. I can't locate what to do. I can't locate capacity. I can't locate how to be in this, what my role and what I'm supposed to do here and how I do it. I can't find that inside myself.
Do you relate to these internalized figures or whatever? Do you relate to them as authority figures? Do you like
No, no, I
how
don't.
do you experience that?
I mean, so I think one thing is, so these are just like a couple like different like examples. And one thing that we sort of talked about earlier is this idea of needing people to show up in your life in a certain way in order for the ego to keep its story going. And like I'd read all these books about like, sixes and authority figures and, was sort of had whatever. And then became very clear to me, like in my relationship with my husband, like I gave him so much power, so much
Mm.
authority
Mm-hmm.
in a way that, and I would never have understood that I was doing that.
Like
And I would have
disowning your
said,
own power.
yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Until I got like very clear upon like, why am I so anxious about this? What is making me tense? Why do I feel like this is going to fall apart? And it was, I care what he thinks. I care he thinks that I haven't done a good job here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I care what he's going to say. And so I would never have called him an authority figure, but I would have sort of, there's an ongoing loop of what's his perspective on this and what am I going to, and if he disagrees, what am I going to do about that?
So for the doubtful sixes that might be listening, is the experience from the point of view of being a six? It feels like these are just people I care about that I'm just keeping in mind. Is that how it is?
Yeah, and I think it's also, um, you could even sort of rationalize it as like, this is going to be a pain in the ass for me if he disagrees.
Mm,
I'm going to have to I'm going to have to deal with that now.
And then it's going to be my problem.
Yeah, yeah.
interesting.
And so this is
So,
me just sort of like getting ahead of my own suffering.
so maybe the word authority figure isn't a good description of what's going on, because I mean it's like someone who has influence. Like you have to factor in uh, this person's viewpoint in your decision making. But I think authority figure just makes sixes, the description, it describes sixes in a way that feels unfair,
Mm-hmm.
in
Yeah.
that they're basically like, I don't know, like a bitch,
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that's not what's going on. It's just like you're factoring this important voice, like you want to factor into your decision making, which doesn't sound like a direct authority figure.
It reminds me of the thing we talked about, maps for the six and the head types, different
Mhm.
maps. And it's as if other people have maps and they're kind of like holographic representations of the world, or a certain stylized hologram, and who has the right map, or who has the right map for this situation, um, and sort of not trusting that you have it already inside you. So I mean, I'm trying to feel around for another concept besides that term authority figure.
Based on what my experience with sixes, it feels like if a six has an experience of, this person got it right, someone that they start to trust, that I need to factor in this person's viewpoint because they might be able to help me figure it out. And maybe over time, as that person proves to get it right, then it's like, well, maybe this source really knows what's going on, and I really have to factor in what they're saying or what they might say. And so that the sixes adopted this person's viewpoint and sort of inserted it into their psyche as something that they need to factor in. But it never feels to me like a six is completely giving themselves over to that one source, because at the same time, the six is still holding on to the possibility that everything that I'm getting is wrong. Like it's never fully all the way into any one viewpoint.
I like what you're saying, Emeka, in terms of, or like thinking about it in terms of just people I have to factor in. Like that's how I often see sixes rationalizing whatever. Like
Right.
they're just rationalizing like, oh, I can't make a decision because, like my mom will be mad at me or my partner or whatever.
Yeah.
And I don't, yeah, I think that it doesn't feel like authority to them in the moment, but I think that underneath some of the layers, there's a ground that we could call authority. But yeah, it's like giving away power in one way or another, because as Courtney, you were saying, it's like, yeah, well, I'll have to deal with this later anyway. And yeah, as a like just from my own perspective, I'm like what? Like so what? Like they can fuck off. I had to
Well,
make
I think
I had to make some recently big decisions that like really pissed off my parents, and like it kind of like makes my like hurts my feelings. But I'm also kind of like, they can fucking deal with it. You know,
Yeah.
it's like,
How?
I just think the word authority figure is so heavy-handed because when you use that phrase, it pulls up the image of like,
it brings up that wound. It brings up the
Principle.
sixth wound.
Yeah.
but it also puts you as a child. Like you think of
Mhm.
Exactly.
teachers and parents, and
That's
it's
the wound.
right, and it's right, but it's also kind of like, well, I don't know if that would be helpful and
For
people to,
newer people.
yeah,
on the
for
ground.
newer people to see that because they would immediately start thinking of the school principal or
Right.
the
And they're like,
teacher or
doesn't
yeah,
relate to now.
like an adult doesn't really think of themselves that way.
Like I totally agree, but like that's the thing is like it's not that we should find a better term, but
Right.
that's why because it's like it's hitting a back wall. You know, it's hitting the sweet spot.
Something real.
The other thing I got a few things to say about this. You know, the other thing on like another example would be my mom is a 2 for and so, you know, when we're trying to figure out holidays and things like that, I mean, she could, you know, she'd stay forever, right? And or she'd sleep in like literally at the, you know, like in our bedroom. You know, like like there's just not enough like merging for her. And and for me, like that's not what I want to do. But I to arbitrate that, I don't say that's not what I want to do. What I do is I say, what's the reasonable thing to do here? So I don't even bother to like ask what like she wants to do this. The answer for me is not what do I want to do? And what I want to do, it's my house. So this is what we're doing. It's, you know, this is a family. She has a perspective. She's my mom. I understand why she wants this, but I'm feeling uncomfortable with it. So I'm going to go to this sort of somehow this like, what would a reasonable person think is okay? And that becomes the solution I come up with. Because also for the 6, the idea that like, well, this is what my mom wants and I want this. Why does what I want this why does that get to be what it is? We both want something. They're not the same. So I need some sort of like neutral arbitrator to defend the position, and it can't be about what I want because she wants what she wants.
Yeah, I relate to that. I think in that terminology a lot, where I'm like, well, why is my opinion so important and yours isn't? Like, who decides that? I'm interested in how many
Sounds
people are.
utterly exhausting.
It is, and it makes having conversations really complicated in my experience because it's a whole thing. Anyway, I am curious as to how many people that aren't on the triangle types will relate to what you're talking about, because I'm over here like nodding and like, yeah, I totally get this. But the reason I'm wondering is when David mentioned how 3 is kind of the archetype of personality, it kind of seems like 6 would be like the archetype of the brain. I don't know, because I feel like a lot of people just relate to this kind of slight executive dysfunction, like inability to make decisions without searching. It just this.
Split will.
Yeah, and I'm wondering how much of that is there's a lot of 6s in society and there's a lot of 9s in society, so they get it, or if that's also kind of a archetype.
I mean, I think for me, and I've like done a bunch of work recently, like where I've had to really kind of get into my 6 and face some of the suffering, um, like in a way that is not about like what's happening in the moment, is just sort of about like this is what you've created. This is how you see things, and this is what's happening because of the way you construct reality. I think the gift of the 6 and part of the attunement and that orientation to, external guidance, the gift of that is a willingness to be moved and to adapt what is the right course of action to new information. It's just that the 6 is way overdoing that sort of search for new information. And I think the other thing is, and this is what helps me kind of connect to the 9 a little bit, part of this idea of like, this is like, it's not, even though it is initially about like, well, is my authority, does my mom or dad have my back in this? That's what initially starts it. But, as it sort of expands, part of this idea of needing multiple viewpoints, I think, is the six's real fear of making a mistake and having to make a decision with imperfect information, and knowing she needs to make a decision nonetheless. And so over relying on the mind and over relying on external points of view, in the same way that you talked about the Japanese Zen garden, there's always something I can't see. Trying in a very sort of genuine and understandable way to decide and move forth in life on the right path, the way that creates the least amount of suffering for themselves and for others. But the reality is that that's never knowable, actually. And it's especially not knowable with the mind. And so for me, the archetype of the six is Hamlet, is the ability to move forward in the face of unfamiliarity and the face of fear and in the face of, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to do it anyway. And
Hamlet's
that
actually a 4 because he's very emotional. I'm kidding. I'm
Shut up,
sorry.
John.
Just have to make fun of all that dumb shit.
Read the room, John.
Sorry, Courtney, you're saying.
Well, I think that's that, like, when you think about the archetype, especially like on the journey of sort of the Enneagram, the 3 is sort of the your eyes open to self-deceit, and that you mistook your mask for who you really are. The 6 is the willingness, the courage to leave that behind and to do something different, not knowing what's going to happen.
Well said.
So I did a lot of heart work recently, and I did a psychedelic experience, and then I've been listening to a lot of myth and thinking a lot about all of this from the perspective of the 6. And John and I were having this interesting conversation where, and he related it a lot to what you talk about, David, in terms of the orientation of the sundial and the different positions of the different types. But I was sort of talking about how the root of the word to decide actually has that "ide" is, that root is actually means to kill. And you think about like homicide or like
Suicide,
genocide, suicide, all of that. And so the idea of deciding really is a willingness to kill off, multiple realities, possibilities, to go to move reality in one direction versus another. And I think that there's a real understandable hesitancy on the part of the 6 to take on that power and agency, because there are real consequences that can't be foreseen to doing that.
Like both 6 and 7 have this sense of like making each decision is killing off like a billion other possibilities, and so it's like you're constantly in the like mode of the Grim Reaper, like just killing possibilities constantly, like collapsing the wave function from the undifferentiated like quantum state into a single thing, and like they're on the edge of seeing that just massive death of possibility.
So to kill or not to kill, that's sort of the split.
But every decision kills.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, even not deciding kills. So that's part of this
Right.
angst. It doesn't, there's no solution, right? It never goes away, that terror. And that kind of the suffering of the 6, of the fear of harm and the fear of fucking it up. It's impossible actually to through the way the 6 operates to actually ever quell that feeling. And looking for all those outside sources to try to, if I could just get more information, I could just get another perspective, I'll figure out what the right thing is to do, is it just makes it worse. And I think it bleeds really well into the 9, because I think the 9's profound sense of connection to everyone, I think the 6 is feeling it also. And that's part of what is causing this terror of, and part of also why I can't arbitrate between myself and my mother, right? Because it's like, whatever I do has an impact on you. And that's terrifying to me.
So, do we feel like we want to go into the 9 space?
Mhm.
Get lost?
We can find
I
it.
think so. I think so.
Yeah, we can find it if there's a place to land.
Yeah, I'm really exhausted now. I have no energy left to give to the 9.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Nine's
guess
All
we
easy.
right, thank you for
just
listening.
Yep.
All right. Good night, everybody.
That's what happens. You get to 9 and everybody gets sleepy.
Bye-bye, 9s.
Time for
Bye.
bed.
Nighty night.
I think of like a Trumpian, like, bye-bye, loser.
Okay, so the 9, in each way that, like, the frustration types built up to the one who was both feeling the wound on the protective and the nurturing side. That happened in the frustration types. It also happened in the rejection types, and now it's going to happen in the attachment types. And the 9 is sort of the culmination of when they're sitting, the baby is sitting on the changing table and looks up and is smiling and expects the mom to smile back, and she doesn't do so. The 9, just like the 3, starts to change themselves and pay attention to the ability to just be and do in the moment is been taken away, because it's now all about paying attention to what it provokes, and we're looking for a certain feeling it provokes in the body, for the 9 in particular, a feeling of being loved. And similarly, the baby 9 is standing on her feet and she's walking towards the toy, and she feels very unsteady and very uncertain and scared, and looks up to feel support, and it's not there. And just like the 6, begins to question, what could we do differently? What could I do differently here to regain a feeling of support and guidance? And I think what's happening for the 9 is, basically, if nurturing and the nurturing function and the protective function are sort of the key enablers of ego differentiation, I think it's a little bit different than the 3 and the 6, in that there is a shape-shifting quality and a willingness to mold and attune oneself to one's external environment. But I think for the 9, feeling that wound on, basically, no matter, any time I try to differentiate on my own, whether it's like an internal sense of self or whether it's an external exhibition of this is an I, it hurts. And I think that there is an attunement to changing what that looks like, to try to regain the feeling, to restore the feeling. But I think there's also this correlation of, it's me trying to be my own person that is the problem. And that's what needs to stop. If I'm willing to sort of give up this sense of an I being its own distinct separate self, and I'm willing to let myself change and respond and adapt to what's going on outside of me, perhaps then that's when I will feel both loved and supported.
Partly too, it's like with the emotional center, it's personality. It's something I can do with the personality, right? And head center, something I can do around guidance or thought or thinking. Whereas with the body, it's so nonverbal, right? That where do you even go with that? It's about your existence. It's about the existence of your body. it's by nature it lacks language of what you
Mhm.
would do.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that in the same way that the 3 is needing to keep their heart kind of dead and separate, and the 6 is needing to keep their mind overactive and distracted so that it never connects to heart and body. When we think about what makes something separate, we begin with the body. I mean, that's the most fundamental way we know that something is its own thing, right? Is a bodily a sense of boundary. And so it makes sense to me that there's a lot of disassociation that needs to happen with body information, because at a visceral level, it will remind the 9 that they are distinct in a way that the ego structure will crumble.
So in this in a sense, resisting the separateness that comes from the body, like my experience of a lot of 9s is that they are very in touch with some of the body's feedback and very out of touch with other aspects of it. And I'm wondering, David, like, what's happening there?
So like well, do you have a sense of what are some of the things that are dissociated from
Well,
as you
so
say that?
what I feel like 9. Well, I mean, like, rage.
Hmm.
It's an example, but then
Yeah.
comfort might be way too front and center.
Right. Yeah, so comfort is probably somewhat of a universal distraction for the 9 from rage, right?
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
And it's sort of a padding, right? Right. You know what I mean? It's like, I
Yeah.
mean, I think of 9 as it's partly at, abstractly, energetically, as always, it's kind of like you're going around putting foam rubber around everything, right? And and because if you ran into one of those sharp corners, then rage would come up. You
Yes.
see, right? So you're kind of going around putting clouds and foam rubber on everything, on all the sharp corners of everything and everyone, if you can.
Okay.
And so, and that's body, right? I mean, that's kind of, I'm putting it in body terms,
Yeah,
right?
no, totally. It's just funny.
Yeah.
It's
It's
just
like I'm moving around and I'm going to bump into this as an energy. And so I want to pad it.
it's funny. So, like, for listeners that don't, know shit about what I waste my time on, like, when I pick on a lot of 9s, I bully 9s online who are in the floor group on Facebook, basically, and just like, I don't actually bully anybody, but like, like, so many people are 9s that are posting about, I'm such a 4, blah 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 blah, and yeah, I mean, I can viscerally sense that padding,
Yeah.
like, and it produces a very negative response in myself, of course, and it's funny how much within Enneagram descriptions and teaching, like, it never ends my fascination with how people interpret 4 in a 9ish way to make, that makes 9s identify with 4, because of how fucking harsh and
Mhm.
frustrated and like pissy and whatever that the
Scratchy,
experience of.
right? It's the
Yeah,
opposite. It's
it's
scratchy, sharp.
so opposite. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like a cheese grater.
Well, well, I think, it's like really sharp angles on everything.
Yeah.
Everything is specific.
Everything.
It's like having a very fine, like a little, those little, like, X-Acto knives people like cut really tiny pieces of
Hmm.
paper out of. You're doing that with your
Yep.
emotional life constantly,
Yeah.
and making little slices and distinctions and ting, 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 and hitting that, and to the point where you cut everything up and you cut yourself. Whereas, like, the 9 is like all those edges get kind of bled and bleeding
Rounded.
and rounded and start to goo into each other, and it's like the paper isn't paper anymore, it's like liquid now and honey or something. And
So here's another piece, though, is that because you're doing that as a 9, because the 9 is doing all of this padding stuff in shadow, let's say, you're building up a whole bunch of unexpressed anger and sharpness and specificity and exactly what I want and rage and all of that stuff. And so when a 9 reads about 4 and gets a sense of 4 rightly or wrongly as, you know, some kind of emotionally difficult something, right? Then
Yeah.
that's part of it, right? That's part of what 9s often experience themselves as very emotional. And
Yes.
it's partly the backlog. It's also partly it's also partly um just that because 9s are so attuned to wanting things to be calm and for that lake to be placid. That's another one of the metaphors for 9 is that any small drop is like a big explosion, right?
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
so you can
Mhm.
experience a small emotion as having been huge or a medium
Right.
sized one as huge, right? So yeah,
Because if it's silent, even the smallest noise can sound really loud.
right.
I just when you said a backlog, I just imagined like you standing there and like a little tiny David in your head going through a file, like, oh, we didn't process this. We should process this now.
Yeah.
And, like,
Well,
just
and
like from a year ago. Here we go.
yeah, well, and one way to say it too, though, just different metaphor is like, especially with anger, rage, one thing that you're not doing as a 9 is you're not define this is really opposite to 4 is you're not defining your experience as you're going, right? And so
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, and so what happens on the anger side is because like 4s and maybe most types generally speaking, you've got anger about this specific kind of thing, you've got anger about this other kind of thing, you've got a little anger mixed with this, you know what I mean? There's a bunch of doors, there's a bunch of different compartments, right? Whereas with 9 it's all going into one fucking huge warehouse that has one door, right?
Well,
Mhm.
that's
And so
inefficient.
and the thing is that then you have some sense of this fire that's in that warehouse, right? Because it's fire, because it's rage, right?
Right.
And so
Mhm.
you do not want to open that door because it's going to blow the hinges off and it's going to destroy everything, right? And so that's another reason. So then it's circular, right? Because so then you make a point because you sense that very unconsciously, and so then you redouble your efforts to not ever open that door, and it keeps building up more, right?
Have you ever had the experience of opening the door?
I was just about to ask that.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's what you hear about when you hear about 9s, having a huge rage
Mhm.
attack, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. No, and
I want to
it's
see that.
yeah, I
You.
don't know if you would. Yeah, no,
It must.
it's an explosion. It's an explosion, and it's I mean, it's murderous. You know what I mean? And I just have to, I've had those explosions, and it's verbal, and I can get somewhat physical. I know to hold myself back, and after this many years of watching myself be a 9, I'm not continuously building up so much rage, right, of unexpressed stuff. That's kind of, I make a point of just saying stuff and saying no, generally speaking. But anyway,
It must also be, I was just thinking about like where 9s disassociate from their, you know, bodily sensations and where not. I would think also there's places you leak that in safe ways.
sure.
Like when you think about like athletes, for example, and other
Oh,
um
yeah. There's a ton of that. There's a ton of leaking. I mean, and John brings up, I mean, this is maybe too nichey to talk about, but like those type 4 groups, um, where both John and I are harassing 9s who think they're 4s. And some of the nines who think they're fours get really angry, right? And there's a lot
Mhm.
of on. In fact, I think nines can be some of the most hardcore, like, keyboard warriors, where you're like,
Mhm.
ah, god damn it, this person's wrong, right? And and you see it a lot, and they block you, and they get really aggressive online. So there's that. But yeah, then there's things like athletics and things like that.
What's funny, I mean, just to for that thing that, being on that four group of full of nines is like David and I are usually, I think, very impartial, and we don't retype anybody, and we'll just somebody be like, "Oh, this is so four," and be like, "Well, actually, like we might say something like, four is actually about being different and individualistic and overemphasizing uniqueness, and the shame is not shame that they don't fit in; it's shame of being like other people." You just, say this sort
Hmm.
of basic stuff, and then it's like yeah, the scolding and anger, not even like, oh, your point is actually, I think you're incorrect here. There's not like a response. It's like, yeah, it's a total anger,
They pounce.
shut it
Mhm.
down
Yeah,
response.
shut
And
it
then
down.
accusations of being like a bad person, like it's all this stuff come, and it's really fascinating.
Well, I think that's
And
so interesting to think about, like, the six being so sensitive to this idea of being brainwashed, right? And this oversensitivity towards it because they sort of realize that it's something that's like, it hits too close to home.
Right.
Um, and it's interesting to think about the nine also reacting that way, um, to this idea of an unwillingness to admit, um, just how much a sense of self they've given up.
Yeah.
well, part of claiming fourness when you're a nine is claiming, finally, some specificity, or
Hmm.
it's claiming all of that backlog of unexpressed emotion. You're holding it, and you're holding it sort of precious in a certain way, right? And
Yeah, that's
so,
a good
yeah.
point. The preciousness. Like, there's a different way that fours are precious about their
Hmm.
feelings, and I see nines that claiming to be fours are precious about their feelings. Like, there's a kind of, I mean, again, it's more general in the nines where um, everybody's experience is their own. Don't touch it, kind of a thing. Like, you don't question it, or don't question the interpretation of their experience. Like, in a way that, like, you say something that is seemingly very non-controversial, non-invasive, even polite and
Hmm.
like engaging, but then it becomes seen as something negative because I guess you're asking for specificity and you're asking for um yes, some kind of reflection or analysis on the state or the feeling or something that that is seen as some kind of violation in a way. And
Hmm.
whereas like the fourth thing is just like there's a my feelings are better than yours, like my more sophisticated, deep,
Hmm.
nuanced, whatever. But the amount of energy that goes into interpreting a feeling is endless for four. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like they're like the
Hmm.
nine wants to sort of cut. Like I'll see nines often cut off the interpretation prematurely, or like don't start to interpret too much. Whereas the fourth thing would be like, let's get really specific, and it gets like really narcissistic and self-absorbed that way.
Yep.
Yep.
So one of the things, like, well, first of all, there was the call that we did where you asked for us to talk about the nine, and then we talked about dogs for like 15 minutes, or puppies or cats or something. And
That was when the rage warehouse almost blew.
and so I was thinking about that, and then also listening to the nine call that you guys did, where
Mm.
nines were talking. A few of them were saying that you can't just ask them. I think Emika was like looking for dating advice, and the nine was saying you can't just ask me what I think like once. You got to do it like 5 or 6 times.
Yeah.
Um, and so
Like, that's okay. Yeah. Yeah. This is normal behavior.
and so I was reflecting that, first of all, you know, the from the outside world, what for many other types would be interpreted as, oh, this person's interested in what I've got to say. The 9
Mm.
does not
Yeah,
feel it that way at all.
that's interesting.
And then also, and there's enough of those reps often maybe that then even the external environment starts discounting their own interest in the 9 to begin as a response, and stops even asking, or just starts taking up more and more space over time.
Yeah, the non-differentiation, the non-individuation, well, the non-expression of it, right, of your individuality, then makes it to where people can't see you and see what differentiates you. And at the same time, as a 9, you're wanting to be seen, and you have a sense that you actually might be kind of boring, right?
Mm.
Because
Aw.
you know you haven't, I mean, unconsciously, you haven't differentiated yourself, you haven't been expressing yourself, you haven't been articulated and colorful, and you know what I mean, and dynamic and so forth, and you're
Mm-hmm.
seeing everybody else be that way, and so you
Mm-hmm.
wonder, sad mopey 9 here, am
Mm-hmm.
I actually just really a boring person, right?
Well, for me, it's, like we were kidding earlier when Emeka dropped off the phone and John said it was because he was like welled up with emotion. Like I find that very moving. And for me, like what comes up when you say that is, kind of grown up language around, you know, if I try to differentiate, you guys might not love me. You may not like me. You might not like what you see.
Hmm.
Which is in some ways like an expression of, from an object relations perspective, that original wound, right?
Right.
It's now being kind of dressed up in language as a grown up that we're more comfortable using.
Yeah, it's again, broken record here, but it's why 9s that get into the Enneagram pick almost any other type except 9. Similar to maybe, at a different level, what happens with 6s, let's say, right? It's also partly similar again, maybe to 6, that you specifically don't see the 9ness when you're a 9, right? Because I mean, that's part of the almost the nature of the substrate of what it is kind of a dispersion as an energy,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, and what I
Mm-hmm.
mean by that more specifically is, like, you might see your wing type, or your fixes, um or your instinctual stacking, and type yourself, give a number type for your instinctual stacking or something like that.
I mean, it's interesting you say that because I was just recently doing this Enneagram workshop on coaching, and we had these different case studies. And then we talked about them in breakout groups, and then we got together as a group to talk about them. And one of the case studies was a 9, and so we all read it, and then we came together as a group, and various people like started throwing out ideas, and myself included, around, it was like a corporate sort of setup, but it was like, the boss, or like we need to talk to the boss about what she needs to do, or the spouse, we need to talk to the spouse about what he needs to do. And the guy who was running the workshop said, like, this is what happens when you have a 9 as a client. You take in that energetic, you start dispersing your own energy anywhere else but the 9,
Hmm.
and start responding to what you like, that feeling of lack of collection of energy. And don't respond as a coach by not treating that, like looking elsewhere, to give your energy elsewhere and shift your focus. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I will sense with not like I can see how I've done that in the past because I'll get the sense that the 9 doesn't want to be bothered. Like,
Hmm.
and it's like what we were speaking to, Courtney, like of how we train our environment to like play
Yeah.
into our type dynamic. It's like nines do a really good job of training people not to bother them. I'm not saying it's not like I don't have anything to work on. I'm not saying that, but just saying that there
Mhm.
is a dynamic where nines sort of train the environment and other people to respond to them in a don't bother me way. And then there comes a time when the nine's like, I wish someone bothered with me, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah, I experienced that dating a 9. He doesn't ever say don't bother me, right? I ask him what's going on. He's like, "Oh, nothing. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine." It always says that, but it never quite sounds like he's fine.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So there's always that
Usually not
question
fine.
of, do you want me to ask you more, or do you want me to leave you alone?
In some sense, it's I don't know if this is exactly right, but in some sense, nines would like you to perfectly know without them
Mhm.
having to say.
That's the sense
Mhm.
that I get. Yeah, it's like a I should know, and then
And
I'm
it's
constantly aware that I don't know.
and that almost maybe swings back to the object relations thing about both parents. It's sort of you're expecting a certain, I don't know how to tie this into object relations exactly, but it's you're expecting a certain, well, just an almost omniscient perfection of what you need in the moment or something, of that threading the needle of being seen, of seeing the nine, but knowing exactly how much energy to throw at them, to make them respond and come out or something.
Mhm.
Anyway,
Like wanting my individual needs like met and seen and attended to without having to differentiate myself as a person.
yes,
There it is.
Mhm.
Yep.
that's it. Yeah.
And so when has that worked for you, David? Like when you were talking, one idea I had is actually maybe not some sort of nonverbal way of communicating that is maybe more successful. I don't know
David,
what that would.
grunt twice if you need you need something.
Yeah, I've got a nine girlfriend, and we do a lot of grunting, actually. And
Ew.
that's not a sexual joke or anything. But anyway,
I highly
It
doubt
is.
that. I
But
highly
it
doubt that.
is.
Yeah, it is.
no, no, I would never.
No.
Um, so the question is, when has that ever worked for me to expect a
Like,
perfect person to
well, like
match me?
what breaks through all of this? Like when has that what has opened this up for you?
What is this that you refer to?
This well this intractable problem that we all do our own equivalent. So I'm asking just specifically about, because I can see it in myself only because I've had like had to work with it a lot, and I'm sure there's more in the six. But the nine is like this kind of training the environment to ignore or not pay attention to or not think you matter,
Hmm.
and then you get to continue to do your own thing and kind of get tinier and tinier and smaller
Hmm.
and less and less separate, and and feel like this is good enough. And then I know that there's unhealthy ways where a nine might finally kind of have enough of that and just leave. But I'm curious for people who are dating nines or who have relationships with nines, or for someone who's a nine themselves, like and who genuinely are trying to try something unfamiliar and try something new. Like what in your experience, like what has broken through that and created like a new dynamic?
Well, that's a 30-year story, so you guys have some time.
Yeah, let's do it.
So, I mean, this is the spiel I've done before that you guys have heard a bunch of times. Courtney maybe haven't, but well, I learned about the Enneagram about 30 years ago, and my initial sense was the thing that I needed to deal with was repressed anger. And so I kind of went on a strange program of just becoming friendly and allowing anger and rage and realizing how angry and rageful I was, right? And well, cutting a long story short, just becoming over time, over the course of years, right, more and more friendly with the fact that I am, at baseline, a fairly angry, irritable person, and being able to express it, um, that in itself begins to articulate you as a person. It individuates you to varying degrees, and it recedes and comes forward, right? I mean, it's not whatever a steady, constant change per se. I can always come back, and I do, into sort of cloud bank existence. Um, but yeah, just really anger itself and being comfortable with it means that I'm saying no, saying what's good, bad, and in between about any given thing, and giving my input on things. And so that's articulating me and giving people a sense of me as a personality. And yeah, so that creates a different dynamic.
Hmm. And so, like, what should Emeka do on his dates with nines?
This is what we all are here for.
This is what we were finally.
It's what I am here for.
Finally,
this is the only
Courtney.
reason.
This is why we have Courtney. Just stop fucking around. We get to it.
This is the only reason I agreed to this podcast.
It's like this is
Well,
the final
it.
round.
Well, no, because I mean, like, I appreciate what David just said, and I hear that was on him, and maybe it always is at the end of the day for all of us, but but I'm also just sort of curious.
Problem is,
Well, I've asked David this question, and I didn't like the answer because
There's nothing we can do. Because
yeah,
they
the
live in
problem
their
is you
own
really,
head.
you really got to, you kind of have to do that thing that I'm talking about, which has is a
30-year
decade.
process.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not done, and I, and it's all it's an evolution, right? But I mean, a nine that has no sense of the fact that they're actually really fucking angry, right? I mean, what are you gonna do? There's nothing, you know what I mean? You can't. There's
They will resist it more than anybody too.
Yeah.
Oh,
They
yeah.
will. They will.
Oh yeah. But point being about that anger is anger is the fuel that is the life force that individuates you, right? So I mean, and so all ye that date nines, it's like you're always you're gonna, when you're trying to clasp onto something, I mean, you're passing your hand through a cloud, you know what I mean? It's just kind of like it's really, I mean, in some ways too, the thing of not knowing what to do with the nine is partly what the nine secretly narcissistically wants, right? Because then you are looking at them, you're trying to figure them out. But then one part of the problem there too is because nines are have that autonomy power thing, then sometimes nines kind of get cocky with that in a secret way. It's everything's covert, right? Uh, and so now I've got power over this person that's wanting my attention, right?
Yeah.
So now that you're in a power seat, you don't want to give that away by giving them a bunch of stuff, right? Giving them,
Heaven forbid.
heaven forbid. Yeah.
And this is something I talked to Courtney about. That
Mm.
as many times as I tried to get with nines, the issue that ends up happening is that on some level, energetically, nines can sense that I'm someone who can take up space, and of course, I can easily take up space in any sort of interaction. So it creates a dynamic where the nine knows that they can take a back seat all the time, and I have to be the one who initiates everything. And it's been interesting to see that I've been with nines who are pretty assertive, and I've even seen nines that I've been with who were assertive with other partners who were maybe less energetically assertive than I am. But it's like there's an unspoken agreement between me and the nine that I'm expected. They just create so much of a vacuum that I inevitably expand to take up that space, and then that becomes the dynamic. And I because I'm not really getting enough feedback, I'm amplifying my own shit, and they're doing more of their own nine shit, and it just doesn't work. So I have not figured out a way to not fall into that dynamic.
I've been with my 9 for working on 3 years now, 2.5, 3 years. And one of the things that has helped us he's pretty self-aware, to be fair. But one of the things that has helped us kind of work through the fog is just me being able to sit and wait for answers, and also us creating our own dialogue or words. So we have like keywords that aren't as like triggering that we can
Hmm.
use. Instead of being like, I'm angry, we can say, oh, you're crotchety, just sort of things
Mhm.
like that just make it a little bit nicer.
So if you're, with a 9, just invent a whole new language.
Pretty much.
No
Yeah.
problem.
That's all we ask.
Yeah.
Psychically
that
know what they
simple.
need, whether they know or not, and invent new language.
It's that simple.
It's a whole new world.
Oh man.
But I do think that, like we were talking earlier about, us training people in our lives to act in a certain way that perpetuates the story of our personality. I think that there's also just as much around attraction. And I mean, the dynamic that you're describing, Emeka, is that like both of you guys get to do your personality, really well together. And can just keep doing that if you wish. And it's only if you're self-aware enough to sort of say, wait a second, this is not what I want. This is not what I'm looking for. I think it's an interesting question, like whether sort of like you sexual types can talk about this more, but like the idea of attraction, and whether who you're attracted to, and whether it's someone who forces you to be unfamiliar or forces you to get to do what you like to do.
That's a really good question. That's something I've given a lot of thought to. For example, I, as an 8, I have had to, at least for the past few years, I've been really working on this ability to not try to make attraction or chemistry happen. And part of the thing about the 8 personality, that's maybe not so obvious with me because I'm a sexual type, and people around me aren't going to necessarily feel the sense of setting the terms and controlling because it's not self-pres or social. But in the attraction realm, is I'm basically saying, I realized recently, I'm basically saying that this is how attraction is going to happen, and this is how chemistry is going to happen. And if you're not, you're going to have to go through this gauntlet of my chemistry, because you don't even have to do anything. I'm just going to create the chemistry for the both of us. And sort of just being able to let that go and not try to make that happen. It's hard to do that with a 9 because a 9's sort of like waiting for something to happen, versus maybe
Mhm.
other assertive types who kind of have their own agenda, and I have more of the opportunity to take a back seat. So that's what I've noticed is like when I'm trying, when I feel like I want to expand as much as possible and be super 8 Emeka, it's like a sort of a 9 would enable that very easily. And I recently had some episodes with a 3 where I could have pushed things, but like I got a chance to really practice not letting go and not trying to make anything happen, and basically having to do things on her terms. So yeah, there is something up to that. To certain, like I think for some personality types, 9s can actually force them to do things that would be opposite to their type. So it really depends.
So one thing I was sort of thinking about as you guys were talking is I have a friend of mine who's a mom of a 9, and this is why I asked David about sort of nonverbal, and then we went into the grunting thing. But like literally, when the kid is having a hard time, this mom basically like tries to like at a bodily level kind of mirror her. And so if she's rolling around on the floor and she's like crying or whatever, the mom gets down on the floor and is like basically trying to create, as David was describing, like a sense of connection that's at the body level. So, and if there's safety there, then, and a feeling of connection there, then the kid is more likely or more willing to kind of express, because there's been this affirmation, not using language, around sort of I'm with you.
That's interesting.
I don't know what the adult equivalent was.
Sometimes I roll around on the floor with David too.
It's a beautiful moment.
Yeah.
It is, yeah. Lots of sweat.
I just
Grunting's important.
Yeah, we got to mirror his grunts.
And the throat clearing.
Now we know what he's been asking for all this time.
That makes so much
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was like a mating call.
Some secret signal for us to care about him.
The new language.
It's the new language.
Me and Brian actually talk in grunts a lot.
Uh-huh.
Like that's an actual thing. We have different sounding. Yeah, we have different sounding grunts for what we want to say.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's kind of fantastic.
It is, because we can say things when we're around people, not make them to not clue them into what we're saying. They just think we're weird.
You're just around people going,
Yep. Pretty much.
So invent a new language is a legit thing that we have to do for our 9s.
Yes,
Have to.
it's very useful. You just need to be creative, really.
high maintenance sloths.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And
Well-
David, what do you think about the archetype for the 9? And how
That's
do
a
you
good
talk
point.
about that?
Well, doing my elementary school iterations of 3,
Mhm.
9 is now 3 3s, right? So that's a certain kind of, like 6 is at least a split, which is a yes and a no. And like a no is, you're pushing against something, right? There's something there, right? Whereas the 9 is the 3 3s is, it's sort of like you're a facsimile of this.
Just a bunch of noises.
Well, yeah. It's sort of like your facsimile of an integration, right, of the opposites. So now it's sort of an embodiment, it's the thing of, like you talk about with the personality type, is an imitation of the essence quality, and you're imitating, let's say, that sort of unifying function, right? Or what's the word? The reconciliation? Is that John? Is that
Yeah, the reconciling force.
reconciling force? So whereas 6s are sort of taking in information and then splitting like 50-50, just constantly peeling off into 50-50, 9s, it's sort of you're reconciling. You're in a loop of and the reconciling is integrating into your body. I don't know if this is too abstract, but you know what I mean? It's like your being is reconciling with everything. And so you are the reconciling, and you're only the reconciling. You're not the thing that reconciles, right? You're not the separate thing. You're just this loop. It's sort of like you are the triangle, right, of the attachment types, right? Because you're the ruler, you're the 9, you're the badass at the top. So
The king.
the king. So yeah, so you're circling, and so a circle is 0. It's nothing, right? So there's the nothingness of the non-individuation, right? But a circle is also encircling everything. So you're the everything. So you're the nothing and the everything. And that's sort of the paradox of 9 at the archetypal level.
In Egypt, the first plurality was 3 rather than 2 because 2s were opposites that cancel each other out. And so plurality, more than oneness, was expressed first with 3. And so 3 3s represented completion. So the Ennead, they have all these Enneads and things that I think are the origins of the Enneagram itself. But yeah, they represented their gods in groups of 9 as this whole, as the representation of the all.
Yeah, did
It's
they have a
interesting to-
Ouroboros also in Egypt?
Sorry, did they have the Ouroboros? Is that what you said?
Yeah,
That's a good question. I think they had things that represented the same principle, but I don't know if they had a snake eating its tail.
Yeah.
It's interesting also, like if you think of the 369 as the journey of self-realization, you know, the 3, the idea of waking up to what's really going on, and this idea of personality versus being, and the 6, sort of the courage of moving forward and trying something different, and stepping into the unfamiliar. And then the 9 is sort of the culmination of that, of, you know, being itself, as the reconciliation of paradox.
Yeah, so that pings the sundial thing too, right? Because 3 is on the east, it's the waking up, it's the sun at dawn, and 6 is going into the dark of the unknown, right? And 9 is sort of the undifferentiated center, the sun at high noon. I don't know what's
It's
good
interesting.
about
You're doing
that,
it.
but
You're doing it that way. Well, it's funny. I did it clockwise, like, and you just did it counterclockwise.
I do it counterclockwise, yeah. And my way is the right way.
Of course.
Okay.
So the god of the Enneagram has spoken, and David, and with that, I have to get going.
Okay. Bye.
All right. Good night,
Talk
y'all.
to you.
That was
Okay,
fun, guys.
Good night.
Bye.